So a number of other speakers have rather kindly spoken about my paper already, so I'm not going to major on bits except to maybe talk about one or two elements that I think are worth raising here. We're all more than happy to talk in the margins afterwards about it. And I'm going to kind of use that framework a little bit just to set a little bit of a context, and then I'm going to jump in and talk about the National Marine Planning Framework based on slides provided by Philip Nugent, plus a hurried phone call I had in City Airport with him yesterday evening. So what's there already, we partnered with the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult, Pinson Masons and IWA to look at making a substantive contribution to the discussion about offshore wind. A number of speakers have spoken about the need for real clarity, a real definite framework, a wider strategy piece. And that is very important. And what we want to do is try and begin to think about some of the next issues, the next generation of things that come after you have that clarity. If you look in the United Kingdom, the experience with the Crown Estate, the work they did on reducing costs, the cost reduction task force, the offshore renewable joint implementation work, there was significant technical regulatory conversations that were happening all across the industry, and those need to happen, but you don't get those conversations without that clarity. So I suppose I'm probably just echoing some points that other people have made in that space. In terms of possibilities, I'm not going to belabor the numbers. As Stephen Wheeler said, with the current generation of offshore, these days, the minimum really credible size for a project is about 500 megawatts and potentially much bigger. So you're talking real scale if there is the framework in place to support that. As we noted in our paper and others, there's quite a pipeline there already and quite a lot of potential. There's a range of estimates at the moment about future deployment, and it's really the boundary in many ways will be our level of ambition and how high a level of preparedness and effort we're prepared to put into it. Everyone, I suspect, has a slide like this somewhere about future deployment rates, but it's merely just to note that they're all across Europe. There are significant levels deployed already, and much greater in the pipeline. This isn't a startup industry anymore. It's a credible, significant, serious contributor to energy generation and will continue to do so. And it's one which has learned the lessons that Anne-Marie are talking about. If you think about the learning cycle in offshore wind, it's been very short. People have had to learn very difficult, challenging lessons and done it in a very short period of time, which I think is quite commendable. And again, speaks that need for that coordinated approach and making sure that the best lessons those lessons are being shared more widely. You'll excuse the pun on res. This is another slide that you see talking about offshore wind. We've seen in a lot of jurisdictions the reduction in bid costs, bid prices, but fundamentally it's now the challenge is delivering on those, and it's one of the interesting things we're going to see from the rounds of the CFDs. Projects are starting to build at these lower costs. So it can be done, and it has been done. And I was very taken with Anne-Marie's point about the need to leverage and leapfrog the experience from other jurisdictions. So if that's not too awkward a segue, I'll start talking about the National Marine Planning Framework, because fundamentally one of the big absences in the Irish case has been, from the sector's perspective, quite a complicated consenting framework once you move offshore. And there's been a lot of people a lot of stakeholders across the space would say there's been a need to find a better way to manage those conflicts. Thinking about kind of a marine spatial planning approach, this idea of the concept of it's a tool to help rectify spatial conflicts in the maritime space. You think about there's all these different kinds of users out there. There's archaeological evidence, there's fishing, potentially naval users, and now we want to do an offshore wind industry. All these users have to cohabit the same space, and they have to use that space in an ecologically sustainable manner as well. So it's a challenge because it's a very dynamic environment, and it's something that you need a strong, robust process around. So the idea was the National Marine Planning Framework was developed, trying to kind of bring a lot of different strands together around renewable energy consents, foreshore leasing and licensing. Anyone there's a few people in the room who could tell you some good stories about the foreshore process in Ireland to date, aquaculture licensing, sea fisheries. It's an idea just to try and bring a kind of coherent basis for all decision making in marine regulation. A point worth noting as well is that the idea is that this National Marine Planning Framework is going to echo a national planning framework onshore as well. So the intent is that there's kind of a coherent approach both onshore and offshore. So it'll be interesting to see where that runs to. In terms of what is the baseline report that's out at the moment, the intent is it's sort of an as-is description of where they're at and where they're trying to get to, the department. The bottom bullet is probably one of the most important things. They're saying big question for the department at the moment is to zone or not to zone. This might seem this mightn't seem very important to some, but it's incredibly determinative of the shape of the industry in a market, how you zone, whether you let the industry do it. One example would be somewhere like Belgium, where it's quite a prescriptive because there's not a lot of offshore space, so they'd be very careful about how they manage conflicts. The UK would be kind of contrasted with sometimes it's probably been more of a slightly policy-led approach to the issue. But that's one of the key questions the department wants to get responses to in the consultation, and I'd encourage people in this room to think about that, to discuss it internally and probably feedback on that issue particularly. Because once you set in place that zoning decision, it's one that doesn't get unwound and kind of basically shapes what's going to happen next. So as I mentioned, they're currently in a bit of a consultation process. There's an issues paper. There's a consultation ongoing till December. It's the first of the kind of 3 consultations they're talking about delivering. The next stage will be kind of a marine spatial plan which are looking at environmental assessments in the first half of next year. That'll also have a consultation process. And that's probably more detailed on kind of the environmental side. But if you're probably interested in influencing the kind of the legal and the regulatory piece and how they're going to make decisions in this space, you probably want to make a submission to that consultation process. Following the MSP, then the intent is you'd get to a final MSP in 2020, and that would also be reflected in a Planning and Development Act that's currently on the books. I won't belabor some of these points, but it's effectively the point that Philip really wanted to make, and he does send his apologies about not being able to attend, was that they're keen to hear from as many users and interested parties in the marine space as possible. They feel they could really benefit from the insights of a lot of people in this room, people who have experienced the sector in other jurisdictions as well. So again, on that theme of trying to leapfrog and learn from best practice and best experience. So if you do want to participate, there's a number of sessions that are running, although those all say October. They have been running the regional public events. Mr. Nugent did say that he really would encourage people to get in touch. They're more than happy to have meetings, engage with people bilaterally, because they're keen that this is a robust process, and they're also aware of the relative importance of this document. So you have an email address, you can even tweet them. Though I'd suggest you probably want a slightly more substantive contribution than a Twitter string. And that's everything on the National Marine Planning Framework. Thank you very much.